Hey everybody, welcome. Apologies if you can't hear us any yet. We weren't actually out there yet. Having a few technical things we're working through, but um, getting that all nailed down. Glad you guys are all with us. Love to hear where people are coming in from. I'm outside Nashville, Tennessee. Love to see where some of you guys are. Looks like some people can hear me, some people not. Okay, hopefully that works out. Sometimes if you can't hear me, well, I guess I'm not going to give the info if you can't hear me because that's not going to be helpful. But looks like we have people coming in from all over the world: Denmark, Arizona, India. Happy to have you all with us. The UK was there last week. Fantastic. Minneapolis, Ireland, Helsinki. Okay, very cool. A lot of these different places. Helsinki makes me think of an incubator that I spoke at not too long ago. If any of you are associated with incubators, I'd love to get in touch with more of them. I'm trying to kind of, um, for different reasons. I'm gonna go backstage real quick and make sure we got all our technical issues worked out. I'll be right back. Okay, sorry about that. Those of you, so you couldn't hear because we weren't saying anything. So we're just kind of working through a few different uh, things there, but glad to have you all with us today. All right, we're a few minutes past, so I guess we'll go ahead and get started. Hey, Mike, glad you're able to jump on. Welcome to today's webinar. What's so special about the special 510K? Why are fewer special 510Ks being submitted today? My name is Etienne Nichols. I'll be the moderator for today's session. Just a few housekeeping items before we dive into the presentation. First, we invite you to actively participate. Some of you have already figured out where the chat is, so that's fantastic. I love seeing where people come in. Use the chat to connect with others and let me know if you can't hear me. It looks like most people can, so that's great. You can also kind of actively participate. We always ask that you play nice. But in the top right, there's also that Q&A section. So the Q&A section is what we ask you to use if you have specific questions you want us to ask Mike at the end of the session during the Q&A. So use that. Even if you don't have a question, navigate over there at some point because there will always be questions in there. And even if you yourself don't have a question, you can upvote some of those questions that are most applicable to you, and we can make sure we get the most relevant questions asked. Second, we always get this question. I think we may have already gotten it, so that's totally fine. We will be sending out the full recording and a handout to all registrants after the live event. So watch your inbox for that follow-up email. And just like to say a few things about Greenlight Guru before we get started. At Greenlight Guru, our mission is to improve the quality of life through our work in the medical device industry, which is likely a shared goal of many of you here today. We host these free webinars to share valuable insights, learn from top industry experts like Mike, and to showcase our industry-leading software solutions. Our software is designed to help medical device companies bring life-changing products to patients faster, more efficiently, and with less risk. Our software suite includes solutions for product development, quality management, and clinical data management, all tailored specifically for the medical device industry. You can join over 1,000 leading medical device companies that trust Greenlight Guru by visiting www.greenlight.guru, greenlight.guru for your personalized demo after today's webinar. And if you've seen the software in the past and you want to see our new version, Ultralight, feel free to reach out. We'd love to show you that as well because we're really excited about that. Now, I'd love to introduce today's presenter, Mike Drews. Dr. Michael Drews is the president of Vascular Solutions, a consulting and training company offering a broad range of services to medical devices, pharmaceutical, and biotechnology companies, including creative regulatory strategy and competitive regulatory intelligence, regulatory submission and FDA presentation, preparation, and defense. Dr. Drews is an internationally recognized expert who brings a breadth of knowledge and hands-on experience in his teachings from the ongoing work he does for FDA, Health Canada, and other regulatory and governmental agencies around the world. He's also a featured keynote speaker on cutting-edge medical technologies and regulatory affairs, and a regular speaker on the Global Medical Device Podcast. If you've heard any of his podcasts, I'm sure you'll be able to recognize the voice immediately. So without further ado, I'll hand it over. Take it away, Mike.
Thank you, Eddie. And can I just confirm that you're able to hear me as well as to see my PowerPoint slides?
Yes to both.
Excellent, thank you. So thank you, Eddie, for that very kind introduction. I want to welcome everybody to this webinar on what's so special about the Special 510K. My name is Dr. Michael Drews. I'm going to be conducting the webinar today. I want to thank my many friends at Greenlight for the opportunity to conduct this webinar. And I also want to thank all of you in the audience for watching, both those of you that are watching right now in real time, as well as those of you that may be watching the recording in the future. Before we begin, I know Eddie mentioned something about my background. I just want to mention just a couple of other things. In addition to consulting for a wide variety of medical technology and medical device companies, I work as a consultant for the FDA as well as Health Canada and a few of the other regulatory agencies around the world. And the reason why I mentioned that, quite frankly, is there's not a lot of people that can say that work on both sides of that proverbial fence. And so I really try to use that to my advantage. As Eddie mentioned, I also do a lot of work with Greenlight in terms of podcasts and webinars, as well as other organizations, and some of them are on the screen right now. I'm very proud to say that on average, I have about 4,000 people per month listening or watching my stuff, including many of my friends at FDA, although I'm sure they would never admit to that publicly. Specifically, last year, I was named one of the 24 MedTech voices to follow in 2024. Interestingly enough, they didn't update their list for 2025, at least not that I know of. I'm not sure exactly why. And then just to highlight a couple of my other podcasts, one of them that we're going to be talking about today is my podcast on artificial intelligence and my podcast on avoiding potential issues with your 510K were the most commonly listened to podcasts last year, and my complaint handling webinar was the 10th most listened to webinar last year. So just wanted to share that little bit of background with you. Now we're going to get into the meat of it, and I do have a few polling questions that I would like to ask the audience. So Eddie, if we can kind of cue this up. The first one is, when modifying an existing device, a Class 2 device, a device that's already on the market, would you notify the FDA first before making the modification, or would you simply make the modification without telling the FDA? Your choices are either yes or no or not sure. Again, let's wait just a couple of seconds and see what the audience says.
So the poll's open. Those of you listening, just so you kind of give an idea, if you navigate, you may have to navigate to the middle between chat and Q&A. There's a button that says poll, and then you can submit your answer there. It looks like we have 23 votes yes, 16 no, and 11 not sure. So if we extrapolate that into percentages, looks like maybe most people would say yes, maybe a third, and then yeah.
Looks like it's sort of a mix across the board, and that's pretty much what I expected. Here's the next question. Given a choice, would you use a special 510K or a letter to file? Once again, your choices are special 510K, letter to file, or not sure. So let's see what our audience says about that one.
Okay. One vote for letter to file, one vote for not sure. Okay, here we go. 45 letters to file, 6 special 510K. So considerably more letter to file than 510K as of right now.
Considerably more, and once again, not surprising. Next, have you considered a special 510K, but for whatever reasons opt to do a letter to file instead? Yes or no?
All right, split 50-50 so far.
Okay.
60-40. Yeah.
Okay, so roughly half and half. Okay, yeah. I'm going to continue on because I just have a couple more. Have you submitted a special 510K before today? Yes or no? And if you have, did the FDA give you their decision within the 30 days as specified in the guidance? Yes, no, or not applicable. So maybe we can do both of those together.
Okay. It's messing up my screen there for some reason, but so I'm not sure how many votes we have for no, but we have 20 votes for have you submitted a special 510K prior to today. So at least 20 people said yes.
Okay, so we have some. And what about the response time for FDA's decision?
Let's open that as well. All right, one more poll if you're able to go check that out. Did FDA give you a decision within 30 days? Yes, seems the majority. Only one no.
Oh, okay, that's a little bit surprising. Okay, good. And finally, which has the lower regulatory burden? In other words, which is easier, do you think, a special 510K or a letter to file?
All right, just open that. It's messing up again. I'm seeing 7 votes for special 510K. Yeah, maybe if I give it just a second and then I'll share the results and maybe that will allow us to see it. I'm not sure why it's messing that number up for me. Okay, 15 votes say special 510K is the lower regulatory burden. And I don't see the letter to file number.
I'm
But it looks
guessing
like
that
in the comments, it's a lot more. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I would guess that most people would think that the letter to file is easier as a lower regulatory burden. And just remember, because that's one of the reasons why this industry gets into so much trouble when it comes to change management, but we'll talk about that. And finally, the last question is, are you considering or would you consider submitting a special 510K in the future? I suspect probably the answer for most people is yes, because that's why you're in this webinar. People that are not considering a special 510K probably wouldn't be in this webinar. So this is probably a bias sample, but let's see what the audience says.
Yes. Looks like the majority are yes.
Okay. Okay, good. I know there were kind of a lot of polling questions, but it helps me to kind of figure out where we are as an audience. All right, so finally, let's get into the subject matter. So here's what I want to try to talk about in the short time that we have today. Pardon me. What exactly is a special 510K and when should it be used? What's so special about the special 510K? Why are we using fewer special 510Ks today than last year, for example? How does the special 510K compare to other types of 510Ks as well as the letter to file? What are the criteria for the special 510K? What goes into the special 510K? How long does the special 510K really take? What does it cost? And then finally, what's new and exciting? And I have a couple of bonus questions that I want to try to talk about, time permitting. And then for those of you that have seen my webinars before, you know that I try to throw in lots of tips and tricks and recommendations and suggestions along the way. And then we'll wrap this up after about 90 minutes or so with some final thoughts, and we'll send you off on your way. So buckle your seatbelt. We're going to be covering a lot of information in a fairly short period of time. But I just want to reiterate one of the things that Edian said at the beginning. There is an opportunity to ask questions, so feel free to type your questions into the chat box, and we'll get to those at the end of the webinar. If you want additional resources, this is sort of a no-brainer. This is FDA's current guidance on the special 510K. And by the way, you will be receiving a handout, a PDF handout after the webinar with all of the slides, and hopefully the links should be working. If the link is not working for whatever reason, then you can always just Google it. So our first major question is, how is the special 510K similar and how is it different to other types of 510Ks? Well, first of all, let's talk about substantial equivalence. All 510Ks rely on substantial equivalence, all types of 510Ks, but they rely on substantial equivalence in very different ways. So at a high level, there are three, well, maybe three, I'll talk more about that in a second, types of 510Ks. One is the traditional 510K. I've done webinars on the traditional 510K if that's something that you're interested in. That's the most commonly used. And there in the traditional 510K, we need to show substantial equivalence to another device, a predicate device. It could be one of our devices already on the market. It could be one of our competitors' devices already on the market. It doesn't matter, but we have to show substantial equivalence to another device. When it comes to the special 510K, which is obviously the topic of today's webinar, we still need to show substantial equivalence. However, it is not to another device per se. Instead, it's substantial equivalence to our pre-changed device, because the most common scenario that special 510Ks are used is when you have a class 2 device, usually a 510K, although it could be a de novo as well. When you have such a device already on the market and you want to make a change to it, it could be a change in the design and the labeling and the manufacturing, what have you. You basically have two options. One is you can notify the FDA, and typically the way you do that is with a special 510K, or the other way is you don't notify the FDA using instead what we call a letter to file. And there are advantages and disadvantages to both of those approaches, as we'll be talking about here. But in the special 510K, when it comes to substantial equivalence, we need to show that our modified device is substantially equivalent or basically the same as the pre-modified or the pre-changed device. In other words, the device that was originally cleared with a 510K or granted a de novo by the FDA. And usually that pre-modified or pre-changed device is our device. That's probably 98 or 99% of the time. It is possible to do a special 510K with a predicate that is not our pre-changed device, but that's a very unusual circumstance. So I won't get into that here. And then finally, the third major type of a 510K is what we call the abbreviated 510K. And here we also have to show substantial equivalence, but we do not show substantial equivalence to a particular device. Instead, we show substantial equivalence to a standard, to a guidance document, to ISO or ASTM standard or something like that. And the logic, very briefly, for the abbreviated 510K is that if we comply to this particular standard and all of these other devices in this product code also comply with that particular standard, then it stands to reason that our device is substantially equivalent to the other devices because they all meet the same standard or standards plural, right? So that's in essence the abbreviated 510K. And one quick comment about the abbreviated 510K, the word abbreviated is very deceptive. Abbreviated doesn't mean shorter or faster. In fact, the refuse to accept or the RTA guidance for the abbreviated 510K is many pages longer than for the traditional 510K. Let me say that one more time. The RTA guidance for the abbreviated 510K is significantly longer than for the traditional 510K. So abbreviated doesn't necessarily mean what you think it is. Kind of to quote a famous politician, kind of depends on what your definition of is. This particular 510K paradigm, what used to be called the new 510K paradigm, is now more than 20 years old. And we have, as you see on this flow chart, the special, the abbreviated, and the traditional. Do we need anything else? Well, actually, there is, in fact, a new type of 510K. I'll put the word new in quotes because it was created about 8 years ago in 2018. It's what we call the safety and performance-based 510K. And FDA put out a guidance on this back in 2019. And I did a webinar on this as well. That's also part of the handout. My question to the audience, and I'll leave this as a rhetorical question, is this quote unquote new safety and performance based 510K, is it substantially equivalent to the abbreviated 510K that predates the SP510K by about 20 years. There are an awful lot of similarities, but I'll leave that as sort of a rhetorical question. But in terms of safety and performance-based 510K, I would like to think that all submissions, not just 510Ks, but all submissions are based on safety and performance. So is there really anything new here other than politics? Well, in my opinion, one of the main reasons why this particular form of 510K was created, specifically the safety and performance of the SP510K, is about politics. If you look at what was happening around that time, I think you might come up to that conclusion as well. In any event, as I said, I did do a webinar for Greenlight on specifically the safety and performance-based 510K, or as I like the subtitle, how do you show substantial equivalence without using a predicate? That's why I say that the SP510K is quote unquote substantially equivalent to the abbreviated 510K, because although you need to use a predicate in both, it is not a specific device as a predicate. Instead, it's a standard. It's a guidance document, something like that. Once again, if you're interested in this topic, I would encourage you to check out that webinar. All right, so now let's focus a little more, since we've had a quick review of the 510K universe, of what's special about the special 510K and when should it be used. Well, simply put, I think this is a terrible name that we call it the special 510K, because there's nothing special about it. This is not like, everybody shows up, gets a trophy. This is the same frustration I have when we talk about special controls as opposed to the general controls. There's nothing special about them. Instead, what I like to call them are the specific controls. But maybe in this era where, everybody shows up, gets a trophy, that's why people are using some of this verbiage. But for those of you that are like me, that are getting a little older, I am so old that when I was a kid, you actually had to win in order to get a trophy. Today, that doesn't seem to be always the case. If you show up, you get a trophy. But anyway, that's a side comment. So let's take a look at a few examples of changes that may or may not qualify for a special 510K. And I cannot emphasize this point enough. The boundaries, the line between what qualifies or doesn't qualify is not necessarily well defined. As a matter of fact, it's very, very fuzzy. But some examples can be minor labeling changes. What the heck is a minor labeling change? Well, if you're updating a warning letter, or if you're modifying your, what I call low-level labeling, your instructions for use, not your indications for use. This is instructions for use. As long as they don't alter the intended use, and as long as they don't alter the indications for use, then you can make some small labeling changes. Minor software modifications. And again, what does a minor or a small update mean? Well, if it doesn't impact the core functions or the safety of the device, then you can probably get away with, and I don't like to use the phrase get away because it sort of implies, there's something nefarious going on here, but that's not my intent. I'm simply saying that as long as you can prove that it doesn't impact the core functions of the device or the safety, then you can probably use a special 510K. If you can't, you'd probably need to use a traditional 510K. If you change a component, for example, you change a non-critical component where the new component has been demonstrated to be to have the same performance and safety characteristics as the original. Once again, you have to demonstrate that, though. You cannot just say, "Oh, this new component is the same." You have to demonstrate that either on paper or by benchtop testing, or possibly even by computational modeling, by animal testing. You have to demonstrate it. The regulation doesn't say how you demonstrate it. That's up to you, but you have to demonstrate. Minor design tweaks. As a PhD in biomedical engineering, I love that phrase, minor design tweaks. What the heck does that mean? Well, if you're making a small adjustment to the device's physical design, for example, maybe you're changing the handle of a laparoscopic device to make it a little more ergonomic, a little more user-friendly, where the changes does not fundamentally change its form, its fit, its function, and so on, then once again, you can probably consider the special 510K. And finally, changes to sterilization methods. Now, this you have to really, really be careful about, because a change in sterilization or clean or disinfection procedures that can be demonstrated to maintain device safety and effectiveness, if you don't demonstrate that, you can get into big trouble. As those of you who have listened to my podcast, you know that I work as an expert witness in medical device product liability cases. Suffice it to say, there was one of the largest class action lawsuits in the history of the medical device industry, which I was an expert witness in, involved certain hip and knee replacements by a particular manufacturer. And long story short, one of the root causes of that lawsuit was improper changes to their sterilization methods. So this one is easy to say on a PowerPoint slide, but the consequences can be very significant. When can a special 510K may not be appropriate? So now you're going beyond the reasons that we talked about a moment ago. For example, if you have a significant change, if the modification introduces new questions of safety or efficacy or changes the device's technology, i.e. the mechanism of action. For example, consider a very simple thermometer. If we have a mercury thermometer and we want to change it to a infrared thermometer, for example, you can absolutely not, or I shouldn't say not, but you probably would be taking on a very, very high regulatory risk if you tried to do that under a special 510K. Why? Because there's a big difference in the technology or the mechanism of action between a mercury thermometer and an infrared thermometer. If the next one is somewhat nebulous, if full test results are required to demonstrate safe substantial equivalence. In other words, if you can, and again, I'm going to use this phrase, get away with just doing some tasting to show substantial equivalence, then you can probably do a special 510K. If you have to do all your testing again, then probably not. In my opinion, that's not a very good type of special 510K to consider. So usually I don't encourage my customers to consider that one very much. It's just too, the potential for problems is just too great. And then finally, when it comes to changing labeling, if you have a bigger change in the labeling, either the intended use or the indications for use. For those of you that are not familiar with labeling, and as a reminder, I did a webinar on this as well, intended use focuses on the device. What does the device do, how it works, its mechanism of action. So the thermometer example that I just gave you would be a change in the intended use. In other words, we're changing from a mercury thermometer to an infrared thermometer. On the other hand, if you have a change in your indications for use, indications for use focuses on the patient. What disease, injury, or condition is the device intended to prevent, diagnose, or treat? So if your pre-change device is, let's say, indicated for diabetes, and you want to change that to cancer, that's a pretty big difference between diabetes and cancer. So you probably would not be able to get away with a special 510K for that. You'd probably be better considering a traditional 510K. But where it really gets interesting is when the differences in the disease becomes less dramatic. So obviously there's a big difference between diabetes and cancer. But what if you're switching from, say, type 1 diabetes, insulin-dependent diabetes mellitus versus type 2 diabetes, non-insulin dependent diabetes mellitus? Now you're much closer together. And the question is, does that constitute a significant enough change in the indications for use to allow you to still do a special 510K? Well, without getting into a lot of detail, my best advice is to build out that argument as strongly as you can and then take it to the FDA as a pre-sub. As some of you may know, I'm a big fan of the pre-sub process to make sure that FDA sees it the same way that you do. In other words, if you think that you can justify changing your indications for use from type 1 diabetes to type 2 diabetes and do that under a special 510K, come up with that justification and then take it to the FDA as a pre-sub and then sell it to them. However, let's be careful out there, because as we're going to talk about when we get to the letter to file, the single biggest reason why companies get pinged on manufacturing inspections, the single biggest reason is change control or the lack thereof. In other words, they will submit a letter to file instead of a special 510K. And then FDA comes knocking on the door and says, hey, we don't think that this was appropriate to do as a letter to file. You should have notified us via a special 510K or possibly even a traditional 510K. And now you're in, a whole bunch of problems. So unfortunately, this happens more frequently than, excuse me, than a lot of people think. So the next question is, why are fewer special 510Ks being submitted today than in the past? Well, one reason, there are a couple of reasons. One reason is the letter to file. As we demonstrated in one of our polling questions at the beginning of today's webinar, many people think that the letter to file is easier, i.e. it has a lower regulatory burden than the special 510K, or if you're in the class 3 universe, a PMA supplement. I think that is exactly the kind of thinking that gets our industry into trouble over and over and over again. And once again, I've done many, many webinars and podcasts on the letter to file. But in a nutshell, the amount of work, the regulatory burden, the amount of testing, the amount of justification and so on that you need to do in order to justify your change is totally agnostic of the special 510K or letter to file decision. In other words, it doesn't make any difference whatsoever. The amount of work going into it is, or at least should be, the same. Because at the end of the day, one thing I've learned as a biomedical engineer, probably 30 years ago, is there are, dozens, if not hundreds of parameters, maybe more, that can influence the safety and efficacy of a device, or in this case, can influence the safety and efficacy of a proposed change to that device. But one thing that I guarantee will never, ever, ever be on that list is whether we do it under a letter to file or a special 510K. And again, this is a topic of a different webinar, but the final decision of letter to file versus special 510K is as much of a business decision as it is anything else. In certain situations, one company might decide to do a letter to file, whereas in another set of circumstances, the exact same circumstances, a second company might choose to do a special 510K. I think if you want to take the a little more conservative approach, you should notify the FDA. After all, nobody's going to get penalized for notifying the FDA, even if you don't have to. So do the special 510K. On the other hand, if you want to be a little more aggressive, if you will, then you might choose not to notify the FDA and do a letter to file instead. But at the end of the day, as long as you can support your decision, regardless of its special 510K or letter to file or something else, that's what is most important. So digging into this a little bit further, here's a snapshot from the 510K database. And you can actually do, if you look at this red circle in the middle here, you can do a search not only of the 510K database, but you can limit it to just special 510Ks. Now, this is obviously a good way to look for regulatory precedent to see if other companies have made similar modifications under a special 510K that to what you want to do your modification on. And if the answer to that is yes, then that's pretty good regulatory precedent that a special 510K is probably okay. On the other hand, if there are other devices out there like yours that have been modified, but those modifications have been done using a traditional 510K and not a special 510K, then there's not much precedent for you. And if you want to do it as a special 510K, you might be taking on a higher regulatory risk because nobody else has done that before. The other thing that I wanted to point out here, in the last couple of years, FDA has added a lot of other choices to how you can limit your searches, as shown over here in the red box on the right. And the one that I want to pay particularly a close attention to is the Predetermined Change Control Plan, or PCCP, because I'm going to talk more about how the PCCP and the special 510K are related to one another. But one last suggestion: there are a lot of different ways that we can use these databases. Want to call it off-label use of the databases, regulatory pun intended? Okay, I'm okay with that. But one of the ways that you can use this by searching the 510K database specifically for special 510Ks is to keep an eye on what your competition is up to. In other words, are they making changes, adding bells and whistles, adding features, adding indications, and so on, that you have not done or that you have not done yet. So this is a great off-label way to see what your competition is doing. And taking that a step further, here's a bonus question, and I'm calling it a bonus question because it wasn't in the original list of questions in the webinar description. How is the special 510K related to the Predetermined Change Control Plan, or PCCP? First of all, what's a PCCP? Well, again, I've done a webinar and podcasts on this, which are in the handout. But one question to start out with is, where and when did the PCCP concept come up with? Maybe not from the FDA. Back in April of 2019, FDA put out this proposed regulatory framework on what has now become called the PCCP. However, that exact same month, I did a podcast on AI where I talked exactly about the same thing. I didn't call it a PCCP, but I presented this for software, including AI devices, and I also expanded it for all devices, including non-software devices. So bottom line, is this coincidence that FDA came up with this idea the same month that I published that podcast? Perhaps. But even if it is, can we at least give credit where credit is due? On the other hand, Oscar Wilde said that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, that mediocrity can pay to greatness. So I have to be a little bit careful what I say here, but I know in a number of situations, FDA has changed philosophies or implemented new procedures based on pardon me, based on suggestions that I've either given the agency directly because I work as a consultant for them, or things that I've talked about in my various webinars and podcasts. Something to think about. So what is a PCCP and when should it be used? Again, this is described in much more detail in my PCCP webinar, but in a nutshell, you can think of a PCCP as a pre-approved letter to file or special 510K or PMA supplement. In other words, the way it works now is you put a device on the market, and then if you want to make a change to that device, you usually, underline usually, notify the FDA with either a special 510K or a PMA supplement. But now we have another option. Now, as part of our original 510K or our original PMA, we can propose our change. We have not implemented the change yet, but we can propose our change in our original submission and talk about what the change is, why we're doing it, how we're going to test for it, and so on. And if FDA pre-approves that change. And again, remember, we haven't even made the change yet, and we have no obligation to ever make the change if we change our mind in the future and don't want to. But the advantage here is we get FDA's approval to make that change, and then we can implement that change at any point in the future that we want without going back to the FDA. So we don't have to worry about any kind of a delay or anything like that, so long as we follow the same criteria that FDA approved in that PCCP in the original submission. So another way to think about this is we have two or more separate but combined submissions. We have a 510K that also includes a PCCP. And one piece of advice I'll give the audience here is, although this is a combined submission, we don't call this a combination product, but the regulatory logic is exactly the same. Even though we call this a combined submission, 510K plus PCCP, I strongly recommend that you organize or you divide that submission so that the 510K is separate and distinct from the PCCP. And I'll show you an example of that in a couple of minutes. But the reason why I make that recommendation is because if you co-mingle the two together, and many people do, if you co-mingle the two together, if FDA has a problem with either your 510K or your PCCP, then the entire ship sinks to the bottom of the ocean. On the other hand, if you decouple the two and talk about the 510K separate and distinct from the PCCP, then they can come back, FDA can come back and say, well, we agree with your 510K, but we don't agree with your PCCP. And so you can still get the clearance on the 510K while you're trying to work with FDA to work out, whatever problems there are with the PCCP. In terms of terminology, though, this is getting even more confusing than it was before. Here's a little regulatory trivia for you. A 510K is cleared by the FDA. A de novo is granted by the FDA. A PMA is approved by the FDA. And now we have this thing called a PCCP. Well, a PCCP is also approved by the FDA. That kind of makes sense in a PMA, but a 510K is not approved, it's cleared. A de novo is not approved, it's granted. So we have a 510K that's cleared with a PCCP that's approved, or we have a de novo that's granted with a PCCP that's approved. Once again, it sounds like it's semantics, but sometimes, this is confusing, but sometimes we go out of our way to make it even more confusing than it really needs to be, because it's just, we're just sloppy with our terminology. It's as simple as that. So what is the PCCP and when should it be used? If you anticipate wanting to make a change to your device in the future, like a label expansion, and when you're prepared to substantiate that change. But remember, a PCCP is not a shortcut, nor should it be. So if we're going to take a lesson, I said a moment ago, we should be very careful here about how we handle changes, because this gets a lot of companies into a lot of trouble. As I said, it's the single biggest reason why companies get in trouble with the FDA upon manufacturing inspections. If any of you are old enough to remember the old TV series, Hey, Let's Be Careful Out There, here's a little short video that might recall your memory.
That's it, let's roll. Hey, let's be careful out there.
Let's be careful out there. I couldn't say that, better if I tried, especially when it comes to topics like change management. And if you have specific examples that you'd like to discuss in the last few minutes of the Q&A section, feel free to bring them up. I'd be happy to talk about it. So in terms of what is the relationship between the special 510K and the PCCP? Well, going back to the 510K web database, and we couldn't do this until fairly recently. So I'm really glad that FDA is finally starting to make these databases a little more powerful. I've been making these suggestions for a very long time. So it's nice that they're becoming implemented. So what have I done? I went to the 510K database and I said, give me all of the special 510Ks that also have a PCCP. And if I click on the box, well, here is just one example that I came up with. It's a special 510K that includes a PCCP. This is a device called the Brightheart View Classifier. And as you can see here, it's a special 510K. And if we take a look at the actual 510K, this is on FDA's website. So here is the 510K homepage. And if I click on the summary, there's a couple of things within this example that I want to share with you. Let me zoom in here a little bit so you can see. The first 2 pages of 510K clearance letters are always boilerplate, so I wouldn't even waste your time, or in this case, it's 3 pages. I wouldn't even waste your time reading it. So the first part to look at is the labeling. Here we have the indications for use. I said earlier that a PCCP can be, or sorry, a special 510K can be used for minor changes or small changes to the high-level labeling, the indications for use or the intended use. However, it's harder to do a special 510K, not impossible, but harder to do it for a big change in the intended use, i.e. going from a mercury thermometer to an infrared thermometer, or in the indications for use, i.e. going from diabetes to cancer. You might be able to go from IDDM, so-called type 1 diabetes, to NIDDM, so-called type 2 diabetes. But from diabetes to cancer, that's a pretty big jump. So they give you all the basic information. Here's the first part that I want to point out, the predicate device. What is the predicate device? Keep in mind, this is a special 510K. This is the pre-changed version of the company's own device. As a general rule, I said, probably 98 or 99% of the time, a predicate for a special 510K is the device that the manufacturer of record already got clearance for and is on the market. And so if that's your situation, it should be very easy for you. Why? Because you have all the access to all of the data, all of the testing that's been done, and so on and so on. You have no excuse, because it's your own device. You have no excuse for not having access to that information. Whereas, and I just had a meeting with one of my customers earlier today, where they were having trouble finding access to the technical details of their competitor's device because they were doing a traditional 510K. But in 98 or 99% of the times, you do not have that problem with a special 510K. And then the other thing that I wanted to point out here is if we scroll down towards the end of the summary, here we have in section 8, the details of the predetermined change control plan. So for those of you that are not familiar with the PCCP, you've never seen this in a 510K before, because this has only been around for the last, well, for software for a couple of years, for all other medical devices, even less than that. So this is the section that I was talking about before, where the company describes what their proposed future change might be, in terms of what the change is, why they're making it, what testing will they do to support it, to show that it does not impact safety, efficacy, performance, and so on and so on. And here you can see in some detail the details that go into that PCC plan. And interestingly enough, this particular special 510K is 8 pages long, of which about half of it, about 4 pages of it, is the PCCP. So the PCCP is not like just like a last minute drop in. It's a significant part. All right, let's continue on. So I talked a little bit about 510Ks and specifically special 510Ks in the relationship to PCCPs. Just for giggles, what's the relationship between a de novo and a PCCP? Well, going to the de novo database, you can see that there's a similar checkbox to see what de novos have been granted with a PCCP. And if we do that search, I did this actually just yesterday, so it's pretty current, 3 de novos have been granted all within the last 12 months. With a PCCP. So this is a very new trend. I'll talk more about trends in just a moment, but this is a very new trend that you should be aware of. And how about for those of you that might be working in the Class 3 PMA universe? What's the relationship between PMAs and PCCPs? Well, once again, there's now an option for PCCP on the PMA database. And if we do that search, there are actually 36 PMAs that have been approved with PCCPs as part of them. So as of this month, September 2025, there have been 72 510Ks with PCCPs. However, only one special 510K with a PCCP. There have been 3 de novos, as I've just shown you, and 36 PMAs, as you see on the screen now. Why? Can you see a trend here? Well, let's go off on a little bit of a tangent and talk a bit about what constitutes a trend. So here we have some data. The question is there a trend? Well, any monkey can see a trend after we have 15 or 20 or more data points. But what happens if we have less data? For example, what happens if we only have the data that's in that yellow box there? We still see a trend, and we still see a positive trend, but it's not nearly as steep as the trend that we see with the more data. Or what if we see this amount of data? Now we see the opposite trend. We see a trend going down only because the limited amount of data. And if we have more data, but like in the yellow box here, now we see a positive trend, and so on and so on. So very much subjective to not just the, very much subjective to the amount of data that we have. What if we only have a couple of data points, 3 data points, or 2 data points, or 1 data point? Or indeed, what if we don't have any data points? Is it possible to see a trend with 0 data points? Keep in mind, on that previous slide, I showed you just a couple of data points. The de novo has 3 PCCPs examples. The special 510K is 1, right? So can you see a trend? Well, most people would probably say no, but I say that seeing a trend before you have much data, or indeed seeing a trend even before you have any data, is when you really start to add significant value. Every person takes the limits of their own field of vision for the limits of the world. In other words, we all tend to view the world through our own particular set of eyeglasses, but we have to recognize that no matter how much data we have, it's never enough. It's never enough. This is why post-market surveillance is so important, and everything else. No matter how much data we have on our particular data device, or no matter how much data we have that from the FDA on the number of 510Ks or special 510Ks or de novos or PMAs that involve a PCCP, it is never enough, no matter how much that we have. Can we ever see the whole picture? And we have to be a little bit careful in our conclusions, because if an alien landed on Earth on a rainy day, what would he or she or it likely conclude? They would probably conclude that it always rains on Earth, because that's the only data point that they have. But is that so? Obviously not, because those of us that live on Earth, we have a lot more data. We know that not only does it not always rain on Earth every day, but it also depends where on Earth that you are. It might be raining one place on Earth and not on another place. So what's the lesson to be learned here? No matter how much data we have, we never have enough. It's always a limited amount of data. Okay, so to wrap up this little tangent on PCCPs, so how is the 510K related to the PCCP? In a nutshell, if you do a PCCP, you probably don't need to do a special 510K, and that street runs in 2 directions. If you do a special 510K, then you don't need to do a PCCP. The difference is if you want to go back through the FDA or not. If you want to go back through the FDA, then you'll do a special 510K. If you don't want to go back through the FDA a second time, then my advice would be consider a PCCP. But there are advantages and disadvantages, so you have to consider all of your options. Here is the reference to the webinar that I did for Greenlight on the PCCP from, I think, last year. So if you're interested in this topic, I would definitely recommend checking out that webinar. And I've got a lot of other resources on PCCPs that are in your handout as well. Okay, a few more questions, and then I want to open this up to some Q&A and some discussion at the end. How does the special 510K compare to other types of 510Ks as well as the letter to file? Well, we've talked about this a little bit already. If you're making a significant change to the labeling or to the technology, and please notice I'm putting the word significant in quotes there on purpose, because that word significant can be interpreted in probably an infinite number of different ways. What may not be significant to you may be significant to the FDA. What may not be significant to your company may be significant to me or to the FDA, and so on and so on. So my best advice is determine whether or not whatever changes that you're proposing to make, determine whether or not they constitute significant change, and then provide as many justifications for why it is a significant change, or alternatively, why it's not a significant change. And then that's step number one. And then step number two, go to the FDA and sell it to them, i.e. as a pre-sub. In other words, here's our current device. We're planning on making the following changes to this device. We have not made them yet. But as a matter of professional courtesy, we're letting you know what they are right now. And we think these are not significant changes. And so we're going to handle them as a letter to file, or we think they are significant changes and we're going to handle them either as a special 510K or a letter to file. There is no single answer. There is no perfect or one correct solution. There are advantages and disadvantages to all of these. And one of my most important jobs as a regulatory consultant is not to tell the company what to do. I do not want to be the regulatory police, which is, let's be honest, most regulatory and quality people are nothing more than the police, because they are constantly telling the company what they can, or more precisely what they cannot do. And I refuse to take that approach. I pride myself on giving the company all of their different options and the advantages and disadvantages to each. So I say, well, option number one, you can do this as a letter to file. Option number two, you can do this as a PCCP within your 510K. Option number three, you can decouple the PCCP and do it as a special 510K later on. And here are all the advantages and disadvantages to each. And then together as a company, based on the company's goals and resources and risk tolerances and so on, you decide which is the option is the best for you given your circumstances. And I guarantee that in one set of circumstances, one company might choose one particular option, whereas in exactly the same set of circumstances, another company might choose a different option. And please do not decide to do a letter to file just because you think it's easier than notifying the FDA with a special 510K, because I think, quite frankly, to be blunt, people that think that way should not be working in this business. It's as simple as that. I know that I'm being blunt, and some people, might say, "Oh, gee, Mike, you can't say that." But surgeons are responsible for the decisions that they make. A medical device professional, if we're going to use that word professional, should be responsible for the decisions that they make. If you make a change as a letter to file, and it turns out that it was not appropriate to do a letter to file, yeah, FDA can ping you on that. They can give you a 483 or more likely a warning letter. But more concerning to me is now you're setting yourself up to all kinds of product liability issues, because if a patient is harmed and you get sued, and I guarantee you will get sued, there's no question about it, if the opposing counsel can show, via a savvy expert witness like me or somebody else, that not only did you make this change, but you made it without notifying the FDA when you should have. And as a result, maybe you took shortcuts, you didn't do the testing and so on necessary. I hope that it doesn't take a JD from Harvard or Johns Hopkins to hear ka-ching, ka-ching, ka-ching. It's not just the regulatory consequences that we have to be concerned about here. It's the product liability consequences as well. What are the criteria for a special 510K? Well, here's the first step. This is the flow chart out of the guidance that I referred to earlier. And it steps you through the process at a very high level. Is the change to the manufacturer's own device? Are performance data needed to evaluate the change? Is there a well-established method to evaluate the change? And finally, can the data be reviewed in a summary or risk analysis format? And then depending on what your answer to each of those decisions are, yes or no, it will tell you either yes, the special 510K may be appropriate, or no, it's not. But the thing that I want to highlight, perhaps most important on this flowchart, is not these different decisions, but what's in this red circle here, which I think should be put on every single flowchart that FDA has ever published. And that is, flowcharts are provided as a visual aid, but do not capture all necessary considerations. Refer to the accompanying text in this guidance or in a different guidance, and so on and so on. So many times I hear people, they call me up and they say, Mike, we've done everything that the guidance tells us to do. We followed the flow chart like the guidance says, but for some reason we're still having problems. Well, to quote a famous politician, I feel your pain. But why would anybody ever assume that the flowchart, whether it's this one or any other flowchart out of the FDA, or for that matter, any other flowchart from any regulatory authority in the world, why would you think that's the end of the story? It is not. It is only the beginning of the story. The beginning of the story. And these flowcharts can be interpreted in many different ways. So come up with what you think is the most appropriate interpretation. And then, as I said before, go to the FDA and sell it to them. So this is and one last thing on this, one of my good friends who used to be the head of the entire 510K program at FDA, that person is no longer with the agency, but she likes to say in many of her public presentations that every single flowchart that FDA has ever published, every single one of them is wrong. And this is the former head of the 510K program at the FDA. Now, I don't go quite that far. I wouldn't say that they're all wrong. What I would say is that they are incomplete. It's the beginning of the story. It's not the end of the story. Well, let's take this a little bit further. What goes into a special 510K, and do we need a predicate? I've already talked about the latter question. Do we need a predicate? The answer is yes. And most of the time, the predicate is our pre-changed version of our device. So let's talk about what goes into the special 510K, the anatomy of the 510K, if you will. Pardon me. And to be honest, I find it kind of silly that I have to waste my time in these webinars talking about what goes into, in this case, a special 510K, because it is all spelled out for you on FDA's website. So let's jump over to this section on FDA's website on how to prepare a special 510K. And if I just skip down to this particular section, it says content and format of a special 510K. And it says, in addition to the items required, these are basically the items required in all 510Ks. You also have to include the items necessary for the special 510K. So if I click on that link, so here is the guidance that I showed you a moment ago. And if we just open up that guidance, again, this is so easy. It's amazing how so many people don't get this. Interpreting the guidance, that's a different issue. But if I just scroll down to the table of content, not only do they have, the specific format and so on, the content of the special 510K, which starts on page 15 here. So here's the content, the cover sheet, the manufacturer's information, all that kind of boring kind of stuff. But if I skip, a few pages down to page 18, here we have a number of examples of changes for devices. Some of them that would be appropriate for a special 510K, and some of them would not. The examples that I like to share in my webinars like this are not coming from the guidance, because why would I insult your intelligence by covering something that was in the guidance like that. But if you're not familiar with these examples, I would definitely look at them, because there might be an example in there that is applicable to what you want to do. How long does it take for a special 510K and really take? And not the theoretical world of guidance documents. Well, according to the regulatory theory, a special 510K is you're supposed to get your decision within 30 days of the FDA receiving it. Well, suffice it to say, that doesn't always happen. Reality can be very different. I think in the polling question that I asked at the beginning, it sounded like several of you got your decision within 30 days. Well, there's two explanations. One is you did a really great job preparing your special 510K, or the other possibility is you got extremely lucky. I can't tell you in your particular individual case whether it was one or the other, or perhaps a combination of both, but I can tell you that oftentimes special 510Ks do take longer. And by the way, one of the reasons why things get delayed, it's not because of the actual review time. It's because if FDA comes back to you on your special 510K after, let's say, 2 weeks, after 14 days, with an AIR, with an additional information request that you often have, depending on the type of an AIR, 180 days to respond to. Now that stops the clock. So now you have, 6 months if you needed to respond to their AIR, and then the FDA clock starts ticking. So even though if they make their decision after 30 FDA days, it's not 30 calendar days, it's 30 calendar days plus 180 calendar days when you were preparing your AIR. So if I don't embarrass myself doing the arithmetic incorrectly, 180 plus 30 is 210 days. 210 calendar days is significantly longer than 30 days, as the guidance would suggest. So bottom line, reality is a lot more complicated than a lot of people think. Unfortunately, the MDUFA performance reports do not include specific 510K subtypes. So if I go, for example, to the most current MDUFA quarterly performance report from May of this year, just a couple of months ago, it's a long honking document, probably around 350 pages. I'm not obviously going to go through the whole thing, but if you go to, for example, the 510K section, which you see on the screen now, unfortunately, they give you the statistics for 510Ks across the board. They don't break it out by type of 510K, like traditional, special, abbreviated, or safety and performance. They just do it across the board. Why? I have no idea. I do think, and I've made this suggestion to FDA many times, I do think that they should break it out in terms of traditional, special, and so on, but they don't. You can calculate those numbers manually, and I have an example in one area where somebody has actually done that, but it's laborious, it's time consuming, and I don't know, maybe somebody can use AI to do it instead. If you come up with a mechanism to do that, please let me know, because I'd love to see your results. But here are some actual review times. Now, this is not for SP 510Ks. These are for 510Ks across the board, but they're coming from only 2 product codes, and these are software product codes. Well, what you see here is the number of days before that 510K is cleared. According to the guidance, a traditional 510K usually is to be cleared within 90 days. So special is 30 days, but traditional is 90 for all the obvious reasons. But so the 90 mark would be right about here. Well, look at how many clearances have come after 90 days, in some cases almost a year later, just for these 2 product codes alone. So the vast majority of 510K decisions are not made within 90 days, as many people would like to believe. That, in fact, is the exception rather than the rule. And the reason why that I chose these 2 particular product codes to highlight is because these are 2 software product codes. And in the software world, people are used to iterating, making changes to software very quickly. Well, if you tell your company that we have an SAMD, a software as a medical device, we're making a change to it, it doesn't qualify as a letter to file. We need to do a special 510K. And you say, well, according to the guidance, it's supposed to take 30 days, but in reality, it may even take 210 days. That's probably not going to make you the most popular person in your building. So there's a big difference between theory versus reality. And here are some individual 510Ks within the product code QFM. You can't read the numbers on the bottom, but it doesn't matter. Each of these blue bars is a specific 510K. The median time for making that decision was 144 days. The average was 154 days. That's about 2 months longer than the 90-day target as the guidance suggests. And when you factor in that time for an additional information request, if you get one, that total time approaches now about 5 months. And similarly for the other product code that I mentioned in the previous slide, QIH, once again, these are all individual 510Ks, and this is not fictitious data. This is actual real data. You can go to FDA's website and confirm this data if you want to, but the mean time to decision was almost 200 days, and the average was about 200 days. That's about 3 months more than the three month or 90-day target from the guidance, and that's about 6.5 months from the submission to the final decision. Once again, a heck of a lot longer than just what the guidance would suggest. So big difference between theory versus reality. In terms of user fees, and this is for fiscal year 25-26, so this is the most current. For 510Ks across the board, the current user fee, if you do not if you do not qualify for a small company discount, is about $26,000. If you do qualify for a small company discount, it's about $6,500. So obviously, if you're a small company and you can qualify as a small company, but there's a bunch of hoops that you have to jump through in order to do that, then you can save yourself money on the submission. However, notice that all 510Ks are the same user fee. Doesn't matter if you're doing a traditional, a special, an abbreviated, or a safety and performance. They're all the same user fee. The question is, why? There's no incentive, certainly no monetary or financial incentive for a company to do a special 510K. I think there should be. If it's less work for FDA to review, because all they're doing is they're comparing your change device to the pre-chain version, it's less work. This is exactly the justification why the guidance says 30 days for review rather than 90 days for review, because as a general rule, a traditional 510K is more work for the FDA. Therefore, it should cost companies more money. On the other hand, that street, in my opinion, should run in two directions. If it's less work for the FDA, it should cost the company less money. But unfortunately, we haven't done that, at least not yet. Just one other thing, and again, we're coming to the end here, so we're going to stop for questions and discussion in just a moment. One other thing with regarding user fees, because this is a major change that just went into effect for this current fiscal year, and that is user fees for establishment registration. It used to be that the establishment registration fee was fixed. In other words, no matter what size company, no matter how much money you make, no matter how many devices you sell, every medical device company pays the same establishment registration fee. That is no longer the case, because now you can qualify for a discounted establishment registration fee if you qualify as a small company. Once again, there are a number of hoops that you have to jump through, but this is something that you should be aware of if that's something that you can take advantage. And one of the justifications for implementing this finally, I've been advocating this for eons. Here's an interesting statistic for you, and that is that more than 80% of the 6,500 medical device companies here in the United States have 50 or fewer employees. more than 80% of the device companies in the US have 50 or fewer employees. And this is one of the many interesting differences between the medical device arena versus pharma and biotech. Because that's not the case most of the time in pharma and biotech. So I think having a lower registration fee for smaller companies makes sense because of the statistic that's on the screen right now. Similarly, I also think having a lower submission fee for a special 510K also makes sense, although we haven't done it yet, for similar reasons. Unfortunately, that's not under FDA's control. That's under Congress's control. Congress would have to mandate that to the FDA, but we haven't done that yet. Okay, so wrapping this up, what's new and exciting in the future of the special 510K? Well, if I ever do a part two, an advanced version of this webinar, we talked a little bit about PCCPs and a tiny bit about software. But as you can imagine, when you get into, for example, combination products, when you get into personalized medicine, like 3D printing of medical devices and so on, the whole concept of a special 510K gets more and more nebulous. For example, in personalized medicine, where you're making only one device for one patient, and you want to make a change to that device, does it even make sense to consider a special 510K? Because you're only made one device, right? So this conjures up a whole bunch of very interesting regulatory questions that, according to our current regulatory paradigm, our current paradigm is not intended to address these, but that is clearly the future. So to wrap this up, we've covered a lot about the special 510K, what it is, how it works, when to use it and when not to use it. But I've also tried to discuss with you the context, for example, how it compares to other types of 510Ks, how it compares to letter to file, how it compares to de novo, how it compares to PMA, because these are all things that you really have to try to understand in order to be able to do your job. So although we have covered a lot of information, this is just the tip of the iceberg. Here is what most people see, but is this the whole problem? Absolutely not, because oftentimes the part that you don't see is more dangerous than the part that you do see. Or what you don't know can be more dangerous than what you do know. And believe it or not, this is real. This came from a rig manager in Newfoundland. They have to divert the path of ships away from these things. In this case, the water was calm and the sun was almost directly overhead. So the diver was able to get into the water and to click this picture. Clear water, huh? They estimate the weight of this thing at 300 million tons. And now we know why they say a picture's worth 1,000 words, and now we know why the Titanic sank. So even though we covered a lot about the special 510K in this webinar, this is just the tip of the iceberg. I think at this point, I'm going to skip these last couple of slides, and let's go to the very end. And Edian, I'm going to turn it over to you to moderate some of these questions. But before we do, I just want to one more time thank everybody at Greenlight Guru for the opportunity to conduct this webinar today, and a special thanks to all of you in the audience, both listening right now in real time, as well as those of you that might be listening to the recording in the future, because if it weren't for you all, we would just all be wasting our time. And last, two last things. First of all, some of the suggestions I made in this webinar are for my industry friends. Some of the suggestions that I've made in this webinar are for my FDA friends, because I know, even though most of them will never admit to it publicly, I know many of my FDA friends listen to my webinars and my podcast. They'll never admit to that, I'm sure. I even have a lot of former graduate students that are working at the agency today. And then the very last thing that I'll just offer, and then Edian, please feel free to take over. If there's anything I can do to help in terms of if you're trying to, think about or consider a special 510K decision, or special 510K versus PCCP versus letter to file and de novo and all those other things, or if there's any regulatory or quality issues that I can help out with beyond that, feel free to contact me. You have my email and phone number and so on. I'd be happy to try to help however I can. With that, Edian, I'm going to turn it over to you, and hopefully we've got some good questions to discuss.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your presentation, Mike. And I'm going to just share a ticker as well. So if somebody wants to click that, see what Greenlight Grew is about as well, feel free. That's kind of something new we're doing. But let's get to the questions. So we have a lot of questions and some more high voted than others. So I'm going to share the first one. This one is from Robin. Since you're saying that the changes should be minor in order to qualify for the special 510K, where is the line drawn for a letter to file? Now, I know that was kind of, you kind of talked about that the entire presentation, but I guess Robin's looking for something succinct here.
Yeah, and Robin, it's an excellent question. I got this question from one of my customers just yesterday. Look, I'm going to be very honest with you. Although there is a line, technically or theoretically, it is a very fuzzy, or let's call it a very undefined line. Believe me, I really wish that I could just draw a definitive line to say that, well, as long as you're on this side of the line, you can get away with a letter to file. But once you cross over that, you can't. You have to do a special 510K or PCCP or something else. Unfortunately, Robin, there is no simple answer to that question. And the reason, quite frankly, is very simple. And that is because the medical device universe is a very, very broad universe. You know, we have everything from wheelchairs and Band-Aids and EKG monitors and all the way to things like totally implantable artificial hearts. How can we possibly draw a line in there somewhere? So here's my best advice, Robin. And some people like this advice and some people don't. Wherever you think that line should be drawn, draw that line there, come up with as many reasons or as many justifications as why I'm drawing that line there and why I'm not drawing it here or somewhere else. That's step number one. And then step number two, take all of those reasons and justifications and go sell that to the FDA. In other words, here is where I'm drawing my line. And more importantly, here is why I'm drawing it there as opposed to somewhere else. And let me say one other thing, Robin, because I think this is an excellent question, but we don't live in a digital universe. We live in an analog universe. In other words, it's not binary. It's not zeros and ones. It's an infinite number of analogs in between, right? So when I'm sitting on the FDA side of the table, and as I said at the beginning, I work as a consultant for the agency as well. So I see these issues from both sides. If a company comes in with a pre-sub, for example, and they say, we're drawing our line here, and they don't give much of an explanation as to why, or they give me some trite explanation like, we're drawing our line here because that's the way that the company, did it before us. I'm sorry, Robin, but that carries no weight with me, and I'm going to be all over them like a cheap suit. On the other hand, if they give me some strong justification, some reasoning, and I don't mean regulatory reasoning, I mean reasoning or logic based on the biology and the engineering of here's where we're drawing our line and why, I'm going to give them, and again, I have to be a little more careful here, but a little more latitude, if you will, than if I see somebody that's just clearly following regulation like a recipe, ticking boxes on a form, because in my opinion, to be blunt, people like that should not be in our business. So Robin, that was a very long-winded response to your question. I hope you found an answer in there somewhere. Might not be the best answer that you were hoping for, but it's the best answer that I could give you. If you have a specific device that you want to talk to me about, I would be happy to arrange a call where we talk about your specific device, and then I can give you a much more specific answer as to where to draw that line. But where we draw that line for your device might be drastically different than where we draw the line from somebody else, for somebody else's device. Hope that makes sense.
Great, thank you so much. I appreciate that. Becky asked the question. This is a little bit longer, but and a little bit detailed, but I actually think it's a really good question in here. If a company is modernizing the platform of their 510K cleared software as a medical device, the intended use and functionality remain the same, but the software architecture is being overhauled and modernized so that it's more scalable, runs more smoothly. Do you think this would fall under the special 510K umbrella as opposed to traditional 510K or even just a letter to file? And I guess if I were to extrapolate this into the hardware world, I'd suppose if you had a single cavity injection mold and you're going to a multi-cavity mold, you're making it much more streamlined for manufacturability. I suppose that might be the equivalent case, but curious what your thoughts are there, Mike.
Yeah, great question. And by the way, Edin, as always, I love your metaphor of the injection molding mold. Let me suggest what I think might be a better metaphor to address
Sure.
Becky's question. Remember, I did sort of a comparison between two different thermometers, a mercury-based thermometer and an infrared thermometer. I think what Becky is describing is the software equivalent of going from mercury to infrared. In other words, if you're changing the architecture, and again, I'm not a programmer, but I am an engineer, so architecture is a somewhat nebulous kind of a phrase. If you're changing the architecture, that could be construed as a change in the technology or a change maybe even in the mechanism of action, kind of like mercury versus infrared. And therefore, a special 510K might be warranted. On the other hand, FDA has put out a few specific guidances on making changes to software when it comes to things like architecture. If you haven't already, I would take a look at those guidances or send me an email. I'd be happy to send you my work in that area. But basically, if I can make this as simple as I can, if you can convince the FDA that changing your software thermometer, if you will, from mercury to infrared does not constitute a significant change, and therefore a special 510K is not required. If you can convince them of that, then I think you're in good shape. If you can't convince them of that, then I think that you're probably going to be looking at a special 510K. But two last things to remember, Becky. One is, what, at least in my view anyway, whether you're doing a special 510K or a letter to file, the work that you're doing, in your case, that validation, the V&V, showing that your changes in architecture are not going to impact safety, efficacy, performance, yada, yada, yada. In other words, at the end of the day, if I use my mercury thermometer and I get 37 degrees and I use my infrared thermometer and I get 37 degrees, at the end of the day, I'm getting 37 degrees. So I've validated my technology. But from a regulatory pathway perspective, I've changed drastically the way I get that number of 37. So as long as you can show that at the end of the day, the validation is the same. Your new version with your new software architecture is going to be the same, give you the same results. I don't know if this is a diagnostic or a treatment or whatever it is, but as long as it's going to give you the same results as your older version, that's the most important thing.
Okay.
Well, once again, a long answer. I hope there was an answer in there for you somewhere, Becky.
Well, it was a longer question too, so I think it merits a longer question or a longer answer. So that's great.
Thank you.
So let's see here. I know we're kind of running out of time here. So for the sake of the audience, let's make this the last one. So this is from Michelle. The question is, my past experience that FDA oftentimes will reject special 510K and suggest a traditional 510K. My question is, have you seen the FDA rejections? What's the acceptance rates for the special 510K?
Yeah, good question. As I said in the, and I'm sorry, Eddie, what was that person's name again?
Michelle.
Michelle. Okay. Good question, Michelle. As I think I said in the webinar, unfortunately, in the MEDUFA statistics, they don't break out traditional versus special versus abbreviated versus safety and performance, nor do they break out the acceptance or the rejection rate. That said, what's more important is if FDA rejects your special 510K, then I can just about guarantee they're rejecting it based on one of two reasons. Either they're not buying your argument that your technology is similar enough to the previous technology. In other words, it doesn't introduce new questions of safety and efficacy. It doesn't change the overall risk, or they're not buying in on your testing methodology or testing matrix. So the first thing that I would find out from the FDA, and if they don't tell you in specific detail, you have every right to ask, okay, you've rejected our special 510K. Please explain to us exactly why you're rejecting it. And with all due respect, Michelle, don't let them get away with giving you some very nebulous, non-specific, high-level answer like, well, you didn't do everything that was in the guidance. Or worse, we are the FDA, it's totally up to us. That doesn't cut it with me. They have to give you a very, very specific reason. Like, for example, your labeling. You're changing from diabetes to cancer, and we think that's too big of a change to do in a special 510K. Or you do a test and the result is not close enough to validate it, something like that. So the percentage, unfortunately, I can't give you, but more importantly is the advice that I just gave you in terms of how you handle that kind of a situation if you run into it. And one last piece of advice that I'll give you, Michelle, and that is a scenario like that theoretically should never happen. You should never have a 510K rejected or a de novo rejected or a PMA rejected. And the vast majority of them are. And the reason why I say that this is an amateur or an elementary school mistake is because I take my device to the FDA before my submission, or in this case, before my special 510K as a pre-sub. And I would say, here's my changes. Here's why I'm making them. Here's the testing that I'm going to do, kind of like a PCCP, but doing it as a pre-sub instead. And one of two things will happen. FDA will say, oh, that sounds great. We look forward to seeing your results, and a little further down the road. Or they'll say, hold on a second, Mike, we don't quite see it that way. And that's when the poker game begins. So long story short, no submission should ever be rejected. 75% of 510Ks are rejected first time out of the box, of which about 80% of them are rejected specifically because of substantial equivalence. And if you're working in the PMA side of the world, about 85% of PMAs are rejected first time out of the box. They result in what's called a major deficiency letter. And in my world, if I get a rejection of any submission by any reason, I view that as 100% failure. 100% failure. If we apply that standard across the industry, the vast bulk of our industry would have just failed that test. But it is an achievable result. And the last thing that I'll say, Michelle, and then Eddie, and we can wrap this up, is this is not arrogance, but just simply pride. I'm very proud in the fact of that for my submissions, I'm not in the majority where 70 to 85% are rejected. I'm in the minority where 15 to 30% are not. In other words, they go through on the first time. And that's something that I think all of us should strive for. Thank you, Michelle. Great question.
Fantastic. Really appreciate it. And I'll just say one thing. I am going to throw out a survey very quickly. I'll put that out there if you would like to fill that out. It gives us insight into what you'd like to see in the future, what you thought of today's presentation, how you'd like us to move forward in the future. That helps us kind of target the industry a little bit better and meet your needs. Mike, thanks so much for the informative presentation, all the valuable insights throughout today's session. It's clear that your experience shines through. So always appreciate you being willing to share your insights. As a reminder to those listening,
thank you.
We'll be sending out today's recording and the presentation slides a little bit later, so keep an eye out for that email. Someone mentioned they weren't able to find last week, so we'll see what we can find there. So I'll do what I can to do that. Also, the ticker to get a demo of Ultralight Greenlight Crew's new software. If you're interested in seeing that, feel free to jump on that, and we can facilitate that so that you can see that and see how we can help you with all of your regulatory and documentation. I am going to now turn on that survey. So if you're able to answer that, we'd love to get any feedback from you. On behalf of Greenlight Guru, thank you all for attending today's webinar. Have a great rest of your day. Take care.